Fixold Cameras produces step-by-step, close-up videos of simple, common repairs and basic maintenance on classic and vintage cameras. Your ability, the quality of your tools, and the condition of your camera will affect the success of your repair endeavor. A successful completion of the demonstrated repairs ultimately depends on your camera repair skills.
The Rollei 35, even upside down, a favorite. The shutter on this particular Rollei is stuck open. Now, why is the shutter stuck open? That's what we need to find out. Is it because the linkage arm is sticking, or is it because the blades are sticking, causing the linkage arm to stick? Either way, the top cover has to come off. Start with the pin face that retains the advance lever. 3 screws on the advance lever also need to be removed. Using a slotted screwdriver that hopefully fits properly so as not to mar the heads, those are removed, and lift the advance lever free. The little screw on the end cap needs to be removed. Be sure to use a properly sized screwdriver. Using a pin face, remove the retainer screw on the back back cover. And using the same setting on the spanner, remove the rewind retainer. Carefully remove the rewind arm and the little shouldered washer that sits underneath it. Turn the rewind shaft to clear the little spring that acts as a detent and a retainer. Pull the rewind shaft free. Now the top cover should easily slide off. Now to the front of the camera to remove the shutter speed control. Using the pin face and the spanner, it's removed. Then there's a little washer that obviously is lifted free. Then there's a little plastic plate, lift it free. Another washer, it comes free. Finally, you can lift the shutter speed dial off the camera. Note the link tab. Then lay the parts out in order. Might help remember how they go back. Now we slide over to the aperture control ASA dial. It is also removed using a spanner wrench on the little pin face, and there's a plastic plate with a washer under it, just like on the shutter speed dial. Okay, of course, now the aperture dial can be lifted free. There's a chrome click ring that sits behind there. But for now, we're going to move to removing the leather. The leather is very thin, so use alcohol to soften the glue so you don't risk tearing the leather. And there are only 4 screws that hold the front plate. 2 on one, 2 on the other side. Imagine that. With the leatherette off and the 4 screws out, the front plate can be removed. Now I'm getting deep into the camera. 4 screws hold the lens plate assembly. Those need to come out. And there's also a small slotted screw that holds the linkage for the slow speed escapement, which also needs to come out. Oops. Anyway, we'll lift the plate off. Oh, there's a little cover plate that needs to be set aside, and the shims, the brass shims, set those aside. And then there's a spring that you need to release off the meter. So there we are, the lens plate assembly. Now we got a good look at the linkage to the shutter, and we're going to have to get to it, get all that out of there. We'll start by removing the front decorator plate and the 3 screws that hold the lens retainer in place. Then remove the ring. You can see the lens retainer there. Remove the distance indicator ring. And make a little scribe mark so as we unthread the lens, we'll see at what point it lifts off and have a reference. That frees the lens retainer. Then the 3 screws that hold the guard ring assembly. I guess we'll call it guard ring. Lift it free. Okay. Now we're going to flip the camera back over, or the lens plate back over, and remove the screw that holds the linkage to the shutter arm shaft, the arm from the shaft. It kind of work it free. It fits pretty tight. Then the 3 screws that hold that back assembly guard in, and it will lift free, and the linkage that is on the shutter release side will also lift with that. See it there? Yep, the blades are still hanging up. Well, we got 3 more long shaft screws to remove. They're alignment screws and retaining screws. With those out, we're going to lift and separate the assembly. Well, there it is, the shutter assembly. Look at all that oil. A valiant but failed attempt trying to get the shutter blades to work. Well, great. We got some stubborn screws. They do not want to come out, so we're going to apply a little heat. After about 2 minutes real time, not 5 seconds video time, the shell of that's a little hot, so using a towel to hold it in place. The screws, though, they come right out. The heat softens whatever is holding the screws in, glue or corrosion or oil or whatever it is, but it does allow them to come out. A nice trick, and as long as you don't go crazy with the heat, you're not going to damage anything. Now we will separate the 2 pieces to gain access to the shutter blades. There they are. They're coated with oil, and the additional oil that was introduced into the camera to try to get them working surely didn't do any good in itself. So we'll lift those free, and they're going to be cleaned off with alcohol, and then the retaining is going to also be cleaned with alcohol. The plate there, and that plate will need to be completely dry. There's no oil on that at all. Okay, with the top of the spring dry plate clean, it needs to be lifted off. There is a spring on the back. You can see it's still sticking. That should bounce, and it's not bouncing. So we'll flip it over and disconnect the spring. This is probably the root of the problem. The entire problem was probably caused by this spring plate. So with the spring plate removed, it can be cleaned properly and then reinstalled. The spring itself seems to have good zing and fling, so we can hook it over the spring plate post, and then we'll flip it over and see how it functions. With the shutter blade drive ring working as it should, it's time to install the shutter blades themselves. A little delicate, a little tedious, but there's only 3 blades, and if you're careful, it'll go well. Make sure the aperture blade assembly is working properly before you reinstall it. And in this case, it is. So now we put the cover plate on the shutter blades, and then we get ready to seat the aperture blade assembly over the shutter blades. It's a bit of a trick sandwich to get the 2 together, but again, it can be done. It might take several tries, but if you seat it kind of in place as shown here, and then lift the 2 together, you should do okay. Go ahead and test the functionality of the shutter blades before you put the 3 screws in. That's how they should snap shut. Time to install the screws. Keep pressure down on the assembly so as it doesn't separate while you're putting the screws in place. Now the whole shebang needs to go back into the lens plate assembly. There is another little plate that, if you recall, needs to be set in position. And that's going to be the shutter speed, shutter linkage, and there's a little hub that goes in there. It all has to slide together. Fortunately, the video seems to be showing these procedures pretty well, as the accompanying narration is fairly lame. Maybe it's said best when nothing's said at all. Well, that didn't last long. Must interject here. Note the linkage is for the release is put in place with the retaining plate, or whatever that's called, chassis plate or something or other, and make sure it works properly. That's good. And more silence. Golden. Okay, now note how the linkage arm goes in place. It does have to go on there a certain way, as it is not asymmetrical. Or is that symmetrical? It is asymmetrical. It's not symmetrical. Not saying asymmetrical lever, but an asymmetrical lever, or rather a lever that is not symmetrical. Tricky stuff, that wordplay. So if you're following along the video and not the narration, you should have the 3 screws in place and ready to move to the next step, which is to install the entire lens plate assembly back into the body chassis. We'll have to link the wind arm with the cocking mechanism of the shutter on the lens plate assembly. It's easiest to do that with the advanced lever already attached to the wind gear on the top, so that when you seat that, you can manipulate the positioning of the wind gear so the two will link together. See how the shutter is cocked here. So it pretty much aligns itself as you seat the lens plate. You'd have to maybe do a little tweaking, but it usually goes pretty good. Now you can slip the brass shims underneath the lens plate without losing the linkage. And with the shims in place, the 4 screws to retain the lens plate assembly can be installed. Don't forget to install the linkage arm screw. Looking good. Moving along. The shutter releases as it should. Change the shutter speeds and wind it. And they change as they should. Now we're looking at the linkage for the aperture and ASA arm. Hook the spring on it so that it stays in position and keeps the pressure against the cam. The arm cover plate can be nestled in position. The levers, everything looks and lays as it should and functions as it should. So now we can put the cover plate on. The cover plate has to have the retainer for the aperture. Well, it's a click retainer for the aperture side. It's a bit tricky to hold it all in place and to seat the plate at the same time. You might have to do it a couple tries before everything stays in position. Keep tension on the chrome ring as you lay the washer and the ASA dial in place. And once it's seated on the shouldered screw, everything from that point forward should be straightforward. Make sure the ASA and the DIN are pointing on the proper side of the dial before you put it in place. And then there's a little washer, and then, of course, comes the retainer. You can use a spanner to tighten the retainer, but to start the retainer threads, you can just use the tip of your the tip of your tweezers. Okay, remember how we laid the parts out in order for the shutter speed dial? Well, now we put them back in reverse order. Nothing of note other than making certain that you get the shutter dial seated to where the tab fits into the slot hole of the shutter dial. Once you've done that, it's pretty straightforward laying the parts in the proper order. Big washer, retaining plate, little washer noted inside the retaining plate, and finally the pin face retainer. Why are these retainers called pin face? Maybe they shouldn't be. Maybe they should be called slot face. Regardless, they need to go in. And then the little spring that links to the meter needs to be hooked up. Be careful when you grab a hold of it that it doesn't release and go to flying to parts unknown. Then check how the shutter speed will follow with the meter linked, and it looks proper. Go ahead and advance it and release it again. Make sure the shutter's working. That looks good. Change the shutter speeds and check them all. Now, once you're certain everything is working as it should be, we can finally put the lens back together. The lens guard goes in place with the thumb and finger access positioned properly. Place the lens retainer ring so that the stop arm is in the proper position. And then we're going to thread the lens in, and we're going to note our scribe mark. It released at the M, and so that's how we're going to seat it so it engages at the scribe mark at the M. By doing it that way, we will have it properly seated for infinity focus. Now we will put the retainer top, lens retainer top, and put the screws in and pull the back ring up to engage the front lens assembly, and so that it will turn and focus as it should. Perfection. Probably ought to put the cover plate screws in place at some point. Get that done. Move on to the installation of the leather, or leatherette. Not sure it's leather. Ply-bond glue would be the first choice to glue the leather on. A high-strength office glue stick might be second choice and more readily available. If the corner edges of the leatherette don't have enough of a memory, the glue stick might not hold them in place. Nothing left but to put the top cover parts on. Thing of note that sometimes can be tricky is to get the lens lock linkage to seat properly so that the lens will collapse. Have to slip it between the front chassis and the plate as it goes on, and then it should seat nicely. Before you fasten down all the extra little parts for the top cover, test the collapse function so that you know that it's working. Push the rewind shaft retainer detent spring aside and drop in the rewind shaft. Make sure that it links properly so that it releases the wind sprocket when you rotate the shaft. Once that's certain, attach all the retaining pieces. Don't forget the shoulder washer that goes underneath the rewind lever. Install the back plate retainer screw. Also, in this particular case, the little rubber stopper fell out, so that needs to be glued back in place. Sometimes it's just flat missing. When you got the glue out, go ahead and glue the decorator ring back around the lens. If the wind lever is still hanging around, you might want to go ahead and install that with the 3 screws that belong to it, and then cover it with the pin face. The final is the end cap screw. And one last check of the shutter function. Well, nothing really left to add except maybe a thank you for enduring a somewhat incoherent narration of possibly an exceedingly long FOC video. Anyway, maybe end it with a little silence.
Thank you for watching. Inspired? Check back for new video postings.